The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Jake finished mopping the last section of the marble floor at Riverside Music Academy. His worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished surface as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the storage room. 3 years he had been working these night shifts, cleaning up after some of the most talented musicians in the country. Jake had grown used to the routine: start at 9 in the evening, work through the night, and finish by 6 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid his bills and gave him something most people didn't have access to: the chance to hear incredible music every single night. The academy was different after hours. During the day, it buzzed with activity. Students rushed between classes, teachers gave lectures, and the sound of various instruments created a symphony of learning. But at night, when Jake worked, it was just him and the echoes of melodies that seemed to live in the walls themselves. Tonight was no different. As he cleaned the main performance hall, Jake could almost hear the ghost of a violin concerto that had been practiced there earlier. He had developed quite an ear for music over the years. Sometimes he would pause in his cleaning to listen to a particularly beautiful passage drifting from one of the practice rooms where dedicated students stayed. Late into the night, Jake had his own history with music, though it was nothing like the formal training these students received. When he was 7 years old, his grandmother had taught him to play piano on an old upright that barely stayed in tune. She couldn't afford proper lessons for him, but she shared what she knew from her own childhood piano lessons many decades ago. Those summer afternoons at Grandma Rose's house were some of Jake's happiest memories. She would sit beside him on the creaky piano bench, her weathered hands guiding his small fingers across the yellowed keys. She taught him simple melodies at first: Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Mary Had a Little Lamb. But as the weeks passed, she showed him more complex pieces. Grandma Rose had a special way of explaining music. She never talked about technical terms or complicated theory. Instead, she would say things like, "This note feels happy, like sunshine coming through the window," or "Play this part like you're telling someone a secret." Her approach made music feel alive and personal rather than academic. When Jake turned 12, Grandma Rose passed away suddenly. The piano lessons ended, and life took him in different directions. His family moved to a smaller apartment where there was no room for a piano. School became more demanding, and later he had to work part-time jobs to help his single mother pay the bills. But music never really left Jake. Even without formal lessons or access to an instrument, he found himself humming melodies, tapping rhythms on his desk during boring classes, and paying attention to every song he heard on the radio or in movies. He had a natural ability to remember melodies perfectly after hearing them just once. Working at Riverside Academy had rekindled his love for music in unexpected ways. During his cleaning rounds, he would often hear students practicing. Some were clearly beginners, struggling through simple scales and exercises. Others were advanced players working on incredibly complex pieces that made Jake stop what he was doing just to listen. The practice rooms were supposed to be soundproof, but Jake had learned which rooms had small gaps around the doors or windows that let music escape. Room 7 had a piano student who played Chopin like it was poetry. Room 12 often had a violinist working on pieces so beautiful they made Jake's eyes water. Room 3 was where the jazz students practiced, and their improvised sessions sometimes lasted until 3 in the morning. Over the months, Jake began to recognize different playing styles and could even identify students by their musical choices. There was the girl who always practiced Bach early in the evening, the guy who loved Beethoven and played it with incredible passion, the jazz trio that met every Tuesday night and created magic together. Sometimes, when he was sure no one was around, Jake would slip into the main performance hall where the grand piano sat like a sleeping giant. He would run his fingers over the keys without pressing them down, remembering the feeling of playing music. His hands would move in the patterns Grandma Rose had taught him, even though no sound came out. One evening in March, Jake noticed something different. There were colorful posters hanging in the hallways that he hadn't seen before. As he cleaned around them, he read the announcement that would change his life. Annual Spring Showcase, open auditions for community members. The poster explained that Riverside Academy was opening its prestigious spring concert to local community members. Anyone could audition, not just students. The selected performers would play alongside the Academy's top students in a concert attended by music industry professionals, local media, and influential community members. Jake read the poster 3 times, his heart beating faster with each reading. An open audition meant anyone could try out. There were no requirements about formal training or music degrees. It was simply about talent and performance ability. For the rest of that night, Jake couldn't focus on his cleaning duties. His mind kept drifting to the idea of actually performing on that beautiful grand piano in front of an audience. Could he really do it? Did he have enough skill to compete with trained musicians? The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. All those years of listening had taught him so much. He had absorbed different musical styles, learned to recognize complex harmonies, and developed his own sense of rhythm and timing. Maybe his unconventional musical education had value after all. The application deadline was in 2 weeks. Jake knew he would need to prepare something special, an original piece that would showcase his unique style. That night, as he finished his cleaning duties, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He was going to audition. The next morning, instead of going straight home to sleep like he usually did, Jake sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper. If he was really going to do this, he needed a plan. He needed to create a piece of music that would represent everything he had learned and felt about music over the years. Jake closed his eyes and thought about Grandma Rose, about all the beautiful music he had heard echoing through the academy halls, about the dreams he had put aside years ago. Slowly, a melody began to form in his mind. It started with the simple, warm feeling of those childhood piano lessons and grew into something more complex and sophisticated. He hummed the melody softly, then began to write it down using the basic notation Grandma Rose had taught him. It wasn't perfect musical notation, but it was enough to help him remember the ideas flowing through his mind. This was the beginning of something big. Jake didn't know it yet, but his decision to audition would lead to the most important performance of his life. The morning of the audition arrived gray and drizzly, matching Jake's nervous mood perfectly. He had been preparing for 2 weeks, working on his original composition during every free moment. The piece had grown from a simple melody into something he was genuinely proud of, a blend of classical structure with personal touches that reflected his unique musical journey. Jake's biggest problem wasn't his music, it was his wardrobe. He owned exactly one nice shirt, and it was currently in the laundry basket with a coffee stain down the front. His work schedule had been particularly busy the past few days, with extra cleaning duties for a special donor event at the academy. By the time he finished his night shift and got home, there wasn't enough time to do laundry and get proper sleep before the afternoon audition. Standing in front of his small closet, Jake faced a difficult choice. He could wear his janitor's uniform, clean and professional, but clearly marking him as maintenance staff. Or he could wear casual clothes that were wrinkled and not very impressive. Neither option felt right for such an important moment. After much debate with himself, Jake decided on the uniform. At least it was clean and pressed. The navy blue shirt and matching pants were comfortable, and he reasoned that his music should matter more than his clothes anyway. He polished his work boots until they gleamed and made sure his name tag was straight. The audition was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Jake arrived at the academy 45 minutes early, using the main entrance instead of the employee door he was used to. Walking through the front lobby felt strange. He had cleaned these floors hundreds of times, but he had never entered as a guest before. The lobby was buzzing with activity. Dozens of people sat in chairs and on couches, some holding instrument cases, others shuffling through sheet music. Jake immediately felt out of place. Everyone else seemed to belong there. They had the right clothes, the right accessories, and most importantly, they had the confidence that comes from being in familiar territory. Jake approached the registration table where 2 student volunteers were checking in audition candidates. The girl at the table was probably 19 or 20, with perfectly styled hair and an expensive-looking blouse. She was laughing with her friend about something when Jake walked up. "Excuse me," Jake said politely. "I'm here for the audition. My name is Jake." The girl looked up at him with a confused expression. Her eyes quickly scanned his uniform, taking in the academy maintenance logo on his shirt pocket and his polished work boots. She exchanged a glance with her friend before speaking. "Oh, are you here to fix something? The auditions are in progress, so you might need to wait until later. We can't have any noise interruptions during the performances." Jake felt his cheeks warm up. "Actually, I'm here to audition. I submitted an application 2 weeks ago." The confusion on the girl's face deepened. She flipped through several pages on her clipboard, clearly not expecting to find his name there. Her friend leaned over to look as well, and Jake heard her whisper, "Is he serious?" "Oh, here you are," the registration girl said, sounding surprised. "Jake Thompson, 2 o'clock audition time." She looked up at him again, taking in his appearance once more. "Are you planning to change clothes before your audition?" "No, this is what I'm wearing," Jake replied quietly. The girl handed him a number, 47, and pointed toward the waiting area. "Just have a seat over there. They'll call your number when it's time." As Jake walked toward the seating area, he could feel the 2 volunteers watching him. He caught fragments of their whispered conversation. Maintenance guy, probably a dare, and this should be interesting. The waiting area was even more intimidating than the registration table. Jake found an empty chair near the back and tried to blend in, but his uniform made that impossible. The other audition candidates were dressed like they were attending a classical concert. Men in dark suits or blazers, women in elegant dresses or professional outfits. Everyone seemed to know each other, or at least they fit together in a way that Jake clearly didn't. A young man sitting nearby was warming up with finger exercises on an imaginary keyboard. His movements were precise and practiced, the kind that come from years of formal training. He wore an expensive watch and shoes that probably cost more than Jake made in a month. 3 seats over, a woman was reviewing sheet music for what looked like a very complex classical piece. Her notes were written in perfect handwriting, and she had color-coded different sections with highlighters. Everything about her preparation screamed professional musician. Jake pulled out his own notes, handwritten on regular notebook paper with a pencil that needed sharpening. His musical notation was basic at best, more like a personal code than proper sheet music. Looking at it now, surrounded by all this professionalism, Jake felt foolish. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he had overestimated his abilities and underestimated what would be expected at an audition like this. The other candidates clearly had years of formal training, expensive instruments, and professional presentation skills. What did he have? A few childhood lessons and 3 years of listening through practice room doors. A well-dressed older man sitting across from Jake leaned forward slightly. "First time auditioning?" he asked in a voice that was probably meant to be friendly but came out somewhat condescending. "Yes," Jake replied. "I can tell. Bit of advice. Presentation matters almost as much as talent in these situations. The judges are looking at the complete package, not just the music." His eyes drifted meaningfully over Jake's uniform. Before Jake could respond, the man continued. "I'm Dr. Williams, professor of piano at the State University. I've been performing professionally for 30 years. These community auditions are a nice way to give back, but the competition can be quite fierce. Are you planning to play something classical?" "Actually, it's an original composition," Jake said. Dr. Williams raised his eyebrows. "Original? That's ambitious for a community audition. Most people stick with established pieces, safer that way. The judges know what to expect from a Mozart sonata or a Chopin waltz. With an original piece, you're asking them to evaluate your composition skills as well as your performance abilities." Jake felt his confidence slipping further. He hadn't considered that his choice might be seen as presumptuous rather than creative. Maybe he should have chosen a classical piece that he could have learned from listening to the academy students practice. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement. "Number 45, you're up next. Number 46, please be ready." Jake looked down at his number. 47, 2 more performances and it would be his turn. His palms were starting to sweat and his carefully planned composition suddenly felt inadequate. Around him, the other candidates seemed calm and confident. No one else appeared to be having second thoughts about their choice of music or their qualifications. To be there. A woman near the front of the waiting area was telling her friend about her recent performance with the City Symphony. Another man was casually mentioning his master's degree from a prestigious conservatory. The conversations swirling around Jake were filled with musical terminology he only half understood and references to opportunities he had never had access to. Number 46. Jake's heart rate increased. 1 more performance before his turn. He closed his eyes and tried to remember why he had decided to audition in the first place. It wasn't about competing with these formally trained musicians or proving that he belonged in their world. It was about sharing something he had created, something that came from his own unique musical journey. He thought about Grandma Rose and those summer afternoons at the old piano. She had never worried about proper technique or professional standards. She had just wanted him to feel the joy of making music. Maybe that was enough. Maybe his different path to this moment had value even if it didn't look like everyone else's path. Number 47. You're up. Jake's number had been called. It was time. Jake stood up from his chair in the waiting area, his legs feeling slightly unsteady beneath him. The volunteer who had called his number was a young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive-looking blazer. He looked Jake up and down with barely concealed surprise before checking his clipboard again. Number 47, Jake Thompson? The volunteer asked, as if hoping there had been some mistake. That's me, Jake confirmed, trying to keep his voice steady. The volunteer led Jake down a hallway toward the main performance hall. As they walked, Jake could hear the muffled sound of applause from behind the heavy wooden doors ahead of them. The previous audition candidate must have just finished their performance. Just wait here for a moment, the volunteer instructed, positioning Jake beside the entrance. They need a few minutes to reset between auditions. Standing there in the hallway, Jake could feel curious eyes on him from other candidates who were walking by. A group of 3 young women in elegant dresses passed them, and he heard one of them whisper, "Is that the maintenance guy everyone's talking about?" The heavy doors opened and the previous audition candidate emerged, a middle-aged woman in a black dress carrying a violin case. She looked confident and satisfied with her performance. Behind her came one of the judges, an elderly gentleman in a gray suit who was making notes on a tablet. The judge looked up and saw Jake waiting in his work uniform. His expression shifted from professional neutrality to visible confusion. He glanced at the volunteer, then back at Jake, then at his tablet as if searching for an explanation. "This is number 47, the volunteer explained, sounding almost apologetic. The judge studied Jake for another moment before nodding curtly and disappearing back into the performance hall. Jake heard the sound of low voices discussing something behind the doors. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, the volunteer gestured for Jake to enter. The performance hall was even more intimidating than Jake had imagined. He had cleaned this room countless times, but he had never seen it from a performer's perspective. The space was elegant and imposing, with high ceilings and rich wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound and amplify it at the same time. Rows of empty seats faced a small stage where a magnificent black grand piano sat under warm spotlights. The instrument looked like something from a dream, polished to perfection and positioned like a work of art. At a table in the front row sat the panel of judges. Jake recognized the gray-suited man who had seen him in the hallway, but the other 2 were new faces. In the center sat a woman who was clearly the person in charge. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and wore a navy blue suit that spoke of both authority and sophistication. This was Director Catherine Reynolds, though Jake didn't know her name. What he could see immediately was that she was someone accustomed to excellence and not easily impressed. Her posture was perfect, her expression was neutral but sharp, and her eyes seemed to take in every detail with the precision of someone who had evaluated thousands of performances. To her right sat a younger man, probably in his 40s with a beard and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like he might be a professor or a professional musician. His expression was curious but skeptical as he watched Jake walk toward the stage. Director Reynolds looked down at her notes, then up at Jake, then back at her notes with the same confusion the other judge had shown in the hallway. She consulted briefly with her colleagues in voices too low for Jake to hear. "Mr. Thompson?" she finally called out, her voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect hall. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice sounding smaller than he had intended. "You're here for the audition?" "Yes, ma'am." Director Reynolds exchanged glances with the other judges. The bearded man leaned over to whisper something to her, and Jake caught the word maintenance in the conversation. "I see," Director Reynolds said slowly. "And you'll be performing what for us today?" "An original composition," Jake answered, walking closer to the piano. "Something I wrote myself." This announcement caused a more visible reaction from the judges. The bearded man sat back in his chair with raised eyebrows. The gray-suited judge looked up from his tablet with renewed interest. Director Reynolds maintained her professional composure, but Jake could see surprise flicker across her features. "An original composition," she repeated, making a note on her paper. That's quite ambitious. How long have you been composing? Jake felt the weight of the question. How could he explain that his composing consisted of humming melodies while he cleaned floors and writing them down on notebook paper? How could he describe the musical education he had received from listening through practice room doors? I've been working on this piece for about 2 weeks, he said honestly. But I guess I've been thinking about it for much longer than that. The gray-suited judge looked up sharply. 2 weeks? You composed this piece in 2 weeks? Yes, sir. The three judges exchanged looks that Jake couldn't quite interpret. He was beginning to realize that his honesty might not be helping his case. In a room where people casually mentioned decades of training and advanced degrees, admitting to 2 weeks of composition work probably sounded ridiculous. Director Reynolds checked her watch, an elegant gold piece that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent. Her gesture was subtle, but Jake caught it. She was already thinking about moving on to the next audition. In her mind, this was likely going to be a brief and awkward performance that they would need to sit through out of politeness before getting back to the serious candidates. Well, she said with professional courtesy, we look forward to hearing what you've prepared. Please take your time getting settled at the piano. Jake walked across the stage toward the grand piano, his work boots making soft sounds on the polished wooden floor. The instrument was even more beautiful up close than it had appeared from the audience. The black surface reflected the stage lights like still water, and the keys seemed to glow with an inviting warmth. He had sat at this very piano dozens of times during his late-night cleaning sessions, but always in silence, always afraid to actually play and disturb the building's quiet atmosphere. Now, he was not only allowed to play it, he was expected to perform on it in front of 3 of the most qualified music professionals he had ever encountered. Jake adjusted the bench to the right height and position, a process he had watched countless students perform during his cleaning duties. He placed his hands on the keys without pressing them down, feeling the smooth ivory beneath his fingers. The piano was perfectly tuned, unlike the old upright at Grandma Rose's house that had always been slightly off-key. Behind him, he could sense the judges waiting with varying degrees of patience and curiosity. Director Reynolds had her pen ready to make notes. The bearded judge was leaning forward slightly, perhaps hoping to be pleasantly surprised. The gray-suited judge was looking at his tablet, possibly already thinking about the next candidate. Jake took a deep breath and tried to center himself. This was his moment, his chance to share the music that had been growing in his heart for years. It didn't matter that he looked different from the other candidates or that his background was unconventional. What mattered was the music itself. He thought about all the beautiful performances he had heard echoing through these halls during his night shifts. He remembered Grandma Rose's patient hands guiding his fingers across the keys. He recalled the feeling of hearing a perfect melody for the first time and wanting to be part of creating something that beautiful. The silence in the hall was complete. 3 judges sat waiting to hear what the janitor in the work uniform could possibly play on their prestigious concert grand piano. Jake sat at the piano bench, his hands positioned over the keys, when he heard the soft sound of the performance hall doors opening behind him. He glanced back to see several of the other audition candidates quietly slipping into the back rows of seats. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes people like to watch other performances to get a sense of the competition or simply to learn from other musicians. However, the expressions on their faces told a different story. Instead of the respectful attention usually given to a fellow performer, Jake saw barely contained amusement and skeptical curiosity. A few of them were whispering to each other behind their hands, pointing discreetly in his direction. One of the observers was Dr. Williams, the university professor who had advised Jake in the waiting area. He had positioned himself in an aisle seat with a clear view of both Jake and the judges' table. His expression suggested he was expecting to witness either a disaster or a comedy show, possibly both. Near the back, Jake spotted the young man who had been practicing finger exercises in the waiting area. He was sitting with 2 other well-dressed candidates, and all 3 were trying to suppress smiles. One of them, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, leaned over to whisper something that made the others stifle quiet. Laughter, Director Reynolds noticed. The small audience gathering and frowned slightly. Auditions were typically private affairs between the candidate and the judges. However, she decided not to make an issue of it. Perhaps these people were genuinely interested in hearing diverse musical styles, even if this particular performance was likely to be brief. Jake tried to ignore the growing audience behind him and focus on his music. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to recapture the feeling he had when he first created this piece during his late-night work sessions. But the whispers and barely suppressed giggles were making concentration difficult. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Thompson," Director Reynolds said, her tone professional but slightly impatient. She had a full schedule of auditions to get through, and every minute spent on this unusual candidate was a minute less for the serious musicians waiting their turn. Jake nodded and positioned his hands on the keys. Just as he was about to begin, he heard a voice from the back of the hall, not quite a whisper, but not quite a normal speaking volume either. "I wonder if he knows how to turn on the piano," said a male voice, followed by muffled laughter from several people. The comment was clearly meant to be heard. Jake's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he tried to maintain his composure. The judges heard it too. Director Reynolds turned in her seat to give the audience a sharp look of disapproval, while the bearded judge shook his head in disappointment at the lack of professional courtesy. Jake placed his fingers on the keys again, but before he could play his first note, another comment drifted forward from the back rows. "Do you think he's going to play chopsticks?" This was followed by more poorly suppressed laughter. This time, Director Reynolds turned completely around in her chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried the authority of years in leadership positions, "if you wish to observe this audition, you will do so in complete silence and with the respect due to any performer. Otherwise, please return to the waiting area." The back rows fell silent, but Jake could still feel the weight of their skeptical attention. He knew they weren't expecting to hear anything impressive. In their minds, he was already a failure, a maintenance worker who had somehow confused himself into thinking he could perform alongside trained musicians. Dr. Williams adjusted his position in his seat, clearly settling in to watch what he expected to be an embarrassing display. The group of young musicians in the back had stopped their whispering, but their expressions still showed amused anticipation, rather than genuine interest in his music. Jake tried once more to begin his performance, but the atmosphere in the room had become almost unbearably tense. Every eye was on him, most of them expecting failure. The judges were being professionally patient, but he could sense their eagerness to move on to more promising candidates. "Take your time," the bearded judge said kindly, perhaps sensing Jake's nervousness. But even this gentle encouragement seemed to come with an undertone of sympathy rather than expectation. The gray-suited judge glanced at his watch, then at Director Reynolds, then back at his tablet. His body language suggested he was already mentally moving on to the next name on his list. In the back rows, someone coughed, the kind of cough that might have been natural or might have been a barely disguised laugh. Jake couldn't tell which, but it didn't matter. The sound broke what little concentration he had managed to gather. He realized that everyone in the room had already made up their minds about him. To the judges, he was a curiosity at best, a waste of time at worst. To the other candidates, he was entertainment, a chance to see someone more out of place than they could ever be. The beautiful grand piano beneath his hands suddenly felt foreign and intimidating. This wasn't his humble practice sessions in the empty building at midnight. This wasn't Grandma Rose's patient encouragement in her living room. This was a formal evaluation by people who had dedicated their lives to musical excellence, and he was being judged before he had even played a single note. Jake took a deep breath and tried to remember why he was here. It wasn't to prove anything to the skeptical audience behind him, or to impress the judges who had already written him off. It was to share something beautiful, something that had grown from his own unique relationship with music. But as he sat there, surrounded by doubt and barely concealed mockery, that original motivation felt very far away. The melody that had seemed so clear and meaningful in the quiet of his apartment now felt fragile and uncertain. He could walk away. He could stand up, nod politely to the judges, and leave the hall. No one would be surprised. Everyone would probably be relieved. The real auditions could continue without this awkward interruption. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Director Reynolds shifted in her seat. The bearded judge leaned back with a small sigh. In the audience, someone whispered something that Jake couldn't make out, followed by the soft sound of suppressed amusement. Jake's hands remained poised over the keys, trembling slightly. This was the moment of truth. He could let the doubts and mockery win, or he could find the courage to share the music that lived in his heart, regardless of how others might receive it. The grandfather clock in the hallway outside began to chime the half-hour. The sound drifted into the performance hall, marking time and reminding everyone that this audition was taking much longer than expected. It was time to play or time to leave. Jake closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. In that moment of quiet, something shifted inside his mind. All the whispers and doubt faded into the background as he remembered sitting at Grandma Rose's old piano, her gentle voice encouraging him to play from the heart, not from fear. He thought about those countless nights walking through the academy halls, hearing fragments of beautiful music drifting from practice rooms. He remembered the feeling of discovering a particularly moving melody and wishing he could somehow capture that same emotional power in his own playing. This piece he had written wasn't trying to compete with the classical masters or impress music professors. It was simply his story, the story of a young boy learning to love music, of growing up and putting dreams aside, and of rediscovering that love in the most unexpected place. Jake placed his fingers gently on the keys. The piano felt warm and welcoming under his touch, almost as if it had been waiting patiently for him to find his courage. He pressed down on the first note, a soft, low tone that seemed to fill the hall with quiet anticipation. The melody began simply, almost hesitantly, like someone testing their voice after a long silence. It started with the basic chord progressions Grandma Rose had taught him all those years ago. But even in those first few measures, there was something different. The timing wasn't perfectly mechanical like a metronome. Instead, it breathed and flowed like natural speech. Behind him, the skeptical audience fell silent, but Jake was no longer aware of their presence. The music was taking him to a different place, a summer afternoon in his grandmother's living room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, the smell of cookies baking in the kitchen. As the melody developed, it began to incorporate elements Jake had absorbed during his years of listening at the academy. A jazz-influenced run appeared in the right hand, something he had picked up from the late-night sessions in Practice Room 3. The left hand found a walking bass line that gave the piece a sense of movement and purpose. Director Reynolds, who had been checking her watch just moments before, found herself leaning forward in her chair. The melody was nothing like the classical pieces she usually heard in auditions, but there was something compelling about its honesty and emotional directness. The bearded judge had stopped looking at his tablet entirely. His eyebrows were raised in surprise as he recognized the sophisticated harmonic choices Jake was making. This wasn't the simple melody he had expected from someone with no formal training. The music showed an intuitive understanding of chord relationships and melodic development that usually took years to master. Jake's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. The piece began to tell the story of his musical journey, the innocent joy of childhood discovery, the sadness of putting music aside, the years of quiet longing, and finally the courage to try again. Each section flowed naturally into the next, guided by emotion rather than strict musical rules. In the back rows, the whispers had stopped completely. Dr. Williams was sitting upright in his chair, his expression transformed from amused skepticism to genuine attention. The group of young musicians who had been making jokes minutes earlier were now listening, with the focused intensity they usually reserved for master classes. The melody reached a bridge section that Jake had written during one particularly memorable night shift. He had been cleaning the main hall after a student recital, and the ghost of a beautiful Chopin nocturne was still lingering in the air. His piece acknowledged that classical influence while maintaining its own unique voice, a conversation between different musical traditions, rather than an imitation of any single style. Jake's left hand found a complex pattern that provided both rhythm and harmony, something he had learned from watching the jazz students practice their walking bass lines. His right hand danced above it with a melody that was part classical, part blues, part something entirely his own. Director Reynolds found herself genuinely moved by what she was hearing. In her 25 years of conducting auditions, she had heard thousands of technically perfect performances that left her feeling cold and unmoved. This was different. The music had a quality that was becoming increasingly rare in formal music education. It had something to say. The piece built to a climactic section where all the different Influences Jake had absorbed came together in a powerful emotional statement. The childhood lessons from Grandma Rose provided the foundation. The classical music he had overheard in the academy halls added sophistication and structure. The jazz and blues elements he had picked up gave it a sense of spontaneity and life. But more than the sum of its influences, the music was unmistakably Jake's own voice. It spoke of someone who had found beauty in unexpected places, who had learned to appreciate music from the outside looking in, and who had finally found the courage to step forward and add his own voice to the conversation. The gray-suited judge had completely forgotten about his schedule and his tablet. He was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years of auditions, genuine surprise and delight at discovering unexpected talent in an unlikely package. As Jake played, his work uniform and polished boots became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the music flowing from his fingers and the story it was telling. This wasn't about technical perfection or formal training. This was about human connection through sound, about finding beauty and meaning in the most ordinary circumstances. The melody began to wind toward its conclusion, but instead of simply ending, it evolved into something even more beautiful. Jake had saved his most personal musical idea for last, a gentle, almost whispered section that spoke of gratitude and hope. It was his way of saying thank you to all the music that had kept him company during those long night shifts, and to the grandmother who had first shown him that music could be a language of the heart. The final notes hung in the air of the performance hall like a question waiting for an answer. Jake lifted his hands from the keys and sat quietly, hardly daring to breathe. He had done it. He had shared his music, his story, his heart with a room full of strangers who had expected nothing from him. For a moment, the silence was so complete that Jake wondered if he had somehow failed to make any sound at all. Had he only imagined playing his piece? Was the audience still waiting for him to begin? Then he realized the silence wasn't empty. It was full of absorption, consideration, and something that might have been wonder. The silence that followed Jake's performance was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the awkward quiet of people waiting for something to end, or the polite pause before obligatory applause. This was the profound silence that comes after something beautiful and unexpected has touched people's hearts in a way they weren't prepared for. Jake kept his hands resting on the piano keys, afraid to move or look up at the audience. He had poured everything he had into those few minutes of music, and now he felt strangely empty and vulnerable, like someone who had just shared their deepest secret with strangers. Director Reynolds was the first to break the spell, but not with words. She slowly leaned back in her chair, her expression completely transformed from the professional skepticism she had worn when Jake first walked into the hall. Her eyes were wide with something that looked like amazement, and she was studying Jake as if seeing him for the first time. The bearded judge beside her had removed his glasses and was cleaning them with shaking hands, a nervous habit that emerged whenever he was deeply moved by music. In his 15 years of teaching at various conservatories, he had heard countless student performances and professional recitals, but very few had affected him the way this simple, honest piece had. Behind the judge's table, the small audience of other audition candidates sat in stunned silence. The group of young musicians who had been whispering jokes just minutes earlier looked as if they had been struck by lightning. The perfectly styled blonde woman who had made disparaging comments was staring at Jake with her mouth slightly open, all traces of amusement gone from her face. Dr. Williams, the university professor who had offered Jake unsolicited advice about presentation and safe musical choices, was gripping the arms of his chair with white knuckles. His entire worldview about musical talent and training had just been challenged by a janitor in a work uniform, who had somehow created something more moving than most of his advanced students ever achieved. The gray-suited judge was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Where did you study?" he asked, his professional composure completely abandoned. Jake finally looked up from the piano keys, his face flushed with the effort of the performance and the intensity of the moment. "I didn't really study anywhere formal," he replied quietly. "My grandmother taught me some basics when I was little, and I've been listening to music here at the academy while I work." This answer seemed to deepen the judge's amazement rather than explain it away. Director Reynolds leaned forward in her chair, her business-like demeanor replaced by genuine curiosity and something approaching awe. "You work here?" she asked. "At the academy?" "Yes, ma'am. Night maintenance. I clean the building after hours." The revelation rippled through the small audience like a wave. Several people exchanged glances of disbelief. The young man who had been practicing imaginary finger exercises in the waiting area turned to his companions with an expression that clearly said, "Did you know about this?" Director Reynolds was processing this information with visible difficulty. She had been running this academy for over 2 decades, had hired and fired countless employees, had overseen thousands of auditions and performances. How had someone with this level of musical ability been walking her halls every night without anyone knowing? "How long have you been working here?" the bearded judge asked, his voice still filled with wonder. "About 3 years," Jake answered. 3 years. Director Reynolds repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "You've been here for 3 years, and this is the first time anyone has heard you play?" Jake nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious again under all the intense attention. The performance had felt natural and right while he was lost in the music. But now, faced with the reality of what he had just done, he was beginning to feel overwhelmed. "The piece you just played," the gray-suited judge said, consulting his notes with shaking hands. "You said it was an original composition. You wrote that yourself?" "Yes, sir." "In 2 weeks?" "Well, the actual writing took about 2 weeks, but I guess I'd been thinking about the ideas for a lot longer than that." Dr. Williams couldn't contain himself any longer. He stood up from his seat in the back row, his face flushed with excitement and what might have been embarrassment at his earlier dismissive comments. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect hall. "Absolutely extraordinary. The harmonic progression in the middle section, the way you developed the initial theme, the emotional architecture of the whole piece. It's sophisticated work. Graduate-level composition." The other audition candidates were beginning to murmur among themselves, but these weren't the mocking whispers of before. These were sounds of amazement, confusion, and in some cases what sounded like professional jealousy. Several people were shaking their heads in disbelief. The blonde woman who had made jokes earlier was now leaning forward in her seat, studying Jake with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Her earlier smug confidence had been replaced by something that looked like respect, mixed with bewilderment. Director Reynolds stood up from her chair, something she rarely did during auditions. She walked closer to the stage, her eyes never leaving Jake's face as if she was trying to solve a mystery. "Mr. Thompson," she said, and her voice had a quality Jake had never heard from her before. Warm, almost maternal, but also filled with professional excitement. "I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you had any formal musical training beyond what you mentioned? Any private lessons, music camps, online courses, anything?" "No, ma'am," Jake replied truthfully. "Just what my grandmother taught me when I was 7 and 8 years old and whatever I picked up from listening while I worked." "Listening while you worked," she repeated thoughtfully. "You mean you learned by hearing our students practice?" "Yes, ma'am. I have good ears, I guess. I can usually remember a melody after hearing it once, and over time I started to understand how different pieces fit together. I noticed patterns in the music, like how certain chord changes made me feel certain ways, or how the best performances had a kind of natural flow to them." The bearded judge was nodding vigorously. "That's an incredibly sophisticated form of musical education," he said. "Immersive learning through observation and analysis. It's actually closer to how musicians learned in earlier centuries, before formal conservatory training became standard." "But the composition skills," Dr. Williams interjected from the back row. "The way you structured that piece, the development of themes, the harmonic sophistication, that suggests an intuitive understanding of musical architecture that usually takes years of formal study to develop." Jake felt overwhelmed by all the technical terms being thrown around. He had simply written music that felt right to him, that told the story he wanted to tell. He hadn't consciously thought about harmonic sophistication or musical architecture. "I don't really know about all those technical things," he said honestly. "I just tried to write something that sounded beautiful to me, something that felt like it told a story." This simple, honest answer seemed to affect the judges even more powerfully than his performance had. Director Reynolds actually took a step back as if she needed to physically process what she was hearing. "That," she said slowly, is exactly what the greatest composers throughout history have tried to do. Director Reynolds found herself in a situation she had never encountered in her distinguished career. She had heard thousands of auditions, had worked with some of the most talented young musicians in the country, and had developed what she thought was an infallible sense for identifying genuine musical ability, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what had just happened in her performance hall. She walked slowly around to the side of the judges' table, never taking her eyes off Jake. Her mind was racing, trying to process not just what she had heard, but what it meant for everything she thought she knew about musical education and talent development. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it, "would you mind playing something else for us?" Jake looked surprised. "Something else? Anything. It doesn't matter what. I just need to hear you play again." Jake thought for a moment, then placed his hands back on the piano keys. This time he chose to play a simplified version of a Bach piece he had heard one of the students practicing repeatedly in room 7. But as his fingers found the familiar melody, it began to transform. The classical structure remained, but Jake's unique musical voice colored every phrase, adding subtle jazz inflections and unexpected rhythmic variations that somehow enhanced, rather than detracted from Bach's original intent. The transformation was mesmerizing. Here was someone taking one of the most studied and analyzed pieces in the classical repertoire and making it sound fresh and personal without losing any of its essential beauty or structural integrity. It was like watching a master painter work with familiar colors to create something entirely new. When Jake finished, Director Reynolds was fighting back tears. She had dedicated her entire adult life to musical education, had built the Riverside Academy into one of the most respected institutions in the region, and had always believed that true musical excellence required years of disciplined study and formal training. But Jake's playing challenged everything she thought she knew about how musical talent developed. Here was someone who had received maybe 18 months of basic childhood instruction, had never studied music theory or composition, had never performed in front of an audience before today, and yet he played with a musical maturity and emotional depth that many of her graduate students would never achieve. "Unbelievable," whispered the bearded judge. "He's taking Bach and making it sound like it could have been written yesterday, but he's not changing anything essential about the piece. He's just finding colors in it that most of us never noticed." Dr. Williams had moved closer to the stage, his earlier condescension completely forgotten. "The technique isn't perfect," he said, but his voice was filled with admiration rather than criticism. "His fingering isn't always textbook correct, and his posture could use work. But the musicality, the sense of phrasing, the way he makes every note count, it's extraordinary." Director Reynolds nodded slowly. She had noticed the same things. Jake's technical skills were those of an advanced intermediate player, but his musical understanding was at a level she rarely encountered, even among professional musicians. It was as if he had bypassed years of technical drilling to arrive directly at the heart of what music was supposed to accomplish. "Mr. Thompson," she said, walking closer to the piano, "I need to ask you something that might sound strange. When you play, what are you thinking about?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I guess I'm thinking about the story the music is trying to tell. Like with that Bach piece just now, it felt like a conversation between two people who really understood each other. The left hand was saying one thing and the right hand was responding, and they were both working together to create something beautiful." "A conversation," Director Reynolds repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that's exactly what good music should be. But most students take years to understand that concept if they ever understand it at all. How did you come to think about music that way?" "From listening, I suppose. During my night shifts, I heard a lot of different students playing the same pieces, and I started to notice that some performances made me feel something while others didn't. The ones that moved me always seemed to have that quality, like the musician was having a conversation with the music, instead of just playing the notes." The gray-suited judge was shaking his head in amazement. "That's a more sophisticated understanding of musical interpretation than I hear in most master classes." Director Reynolds felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was thrilled to have discovered such remarkable talent, but she was also deeply troubled by the implications of what she was witnessing. How many other people with similar natural ability were walking through the world without ever getting the chance to develop their gifts? How many potential musicians were dismissed because they didn't fit the traditional mold of what musical talent was supposed to look like? "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice taking on a tone of urgency, "what are your plans? I mean, beyond this audition? What do you want to do with your music?" Jake looked uncertain. "I don't really know. I entered this audition mostly because I wanted to see if I could do it. If the music I've been hearing in my head could actually sound good when I played it out loud. I hadn't really thought much beyond that. Would you be interested in studying music formally? We have programs here that could help you develop your technical skills while preserving that incredible natural musicality you possess." The question hung in the air like a bridge between Jake's old life and possibilities he had never dared to imagine. In the back rows, the other audition candidates were listening to this conversation with fascination. Several of them were current Academy students who knew exactly how difficult it was to gain Director Reynolds' attention, let alone her personal interest in their musical development. "I don't know if I could afford something like that," Jake said honestly. "I'm here on a work visa, and the night maintenance job barely covers my expenses." Director Reynolds exchanged a meaningful look with the other judges. They were all thinking the same thing. Talent like this couldn't be allowed to slip away due to financial constraints. "Mr. Thompson," she said, and everyone in the room could hear the decision forming in her voice. "What would you say if I told you that we might be able to work something out? A work-study program, perhaps, where you could continue your maintenance duties part-time while taking classes and receiving private instruction." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "You would do that? For talent like yours?" "Absolutely. But I have to be honest with you, it wouldn't be easy. You'd be working and studying at the same time, and you'd need to catch up on a lot of technical foundation that most students learn over many years. Are you willing to work that hard?" Jake thought about the question for exactly 3 seconds. He thought about Grandma Rose, who had always believed he had something special but had never lived to see him pursue it. He thought about all those nights walking through the Academy halls, dreaming of being part of the musical conversations he overheard. He thought about the feeling he had just experienced, sharing his music with people who understood and appreciated it. "Yes, ma'am," he said firmly. "I'm willing to work that hard." Director Reynolds smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile anyone in the room had ever seen from her. "Then welcome to Riverside Academy. Mr. Thompson, let's see what we can accomplish together." The sound of applause filled the performance hall, starting slowly with Director Reynolds and building as the other judges and audience members joined in. But this wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that typically followed auditions. This was genuine appreciation, the kind of sustained applause usually reserved for professional concerts and graduation ceremonies. Jake sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. Just 30 minutes ago, these same people had been whispering jokes about him. Now they were applauding with enthusiasm that seemed to surprise even themselves. The transformation felt almost dreamlike. Dr. Williams was applauding more enthusiastically than anyone, his earlier skepticism completely forgotten. As the clapping died down, he stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his decades in musical education, "we have just witnessed something extraordinary. This young man has reminded all of us why we fell in love with music in the first place." Several of the other audition candidates nodded in agreement. The blonde woman who had made disparaging comments earlier approached the stage, her expression a mixture of admiration and what might have been embarrassment. "That was incredible," she said to Jake. "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on appearances and I was completely wrong. Your music was beautiful." Similar sentiments echoed around the room as other candidates came forward to introduce themselves properly and express their appreciation for Jake's performance. The young man who had been practicing finger exercises shook Jake's hand warmly. "I've been studying piano for 15 years, he said, "and I've never heard anyone make music sound so natural and effortless. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Director Reynolds was in conversation with the other judges, but Jake could see them nodding enthusiastically as she spoke. After a few minutes, she returned to address Jake directly. "Mr. Thompson, we'd like to offer you something more comprehensive than a simple work-study arrangement. We're prepared to offer you a full scholarship to our degree program, with a part-time teaching assistant position that would provide a living stipend. You'd be helping with beginning students while taking your own classes." Jake felt dizzy with the magnitude of what was being offered. "A teaching position? But I'm not qualified to teach anyone. The bearded judge laughed warmly. Mr. Thompson, you've just demonstrated something that many formally trained musicians struggle with their entire careers. You understand that music is about communication and emotion, not just technical accuracy. That's exactly what beginning students need to learn. Besides, Director Reynolds added, you'd start with very basic instruction under close supervision. Think of it as learning to teach while you're learning to play at a more advanced level. It's actually a very effective way to deepen your own understanding. Dr. Williams approached the group, his expression earnest. Mr. Thompson, I hope you'll consider this opportunity seriously. In my 30 years of teaching, I've seen countless students with excellent technical training who never developed the musical sensitivity you displayed today. What you have is rare and valuable. But I have so much to learn, Jake protested. Music theory, proper technique, composition rules. Yes, you do, Director Reynolds agreed. But here's what you need to understand. Those are tools to help you express what you already have inside you. Many students spend so much time learning the tools that they forget why they wanted to make music in the first place. You're starting with the most important thing, a genuine musical voice. Everything else can be taught. The gray-suited judge nodded emphatically. I've heard hundreds of technically perfect auditions that left me feeling nothing. Your performance today reminded me why I became a musician originally. That's worth more than perfect scales or flawless sight reading. Jake looked around the room at all the faces watching him expectantly. These were serious musicians, accomplished professionals, people who had dedicated their lives to musical excellence. And they were all telling him that he belonged among them. There's something else, Director Reynolds said, her voice taking on an excited tone. The spring showcase performance is in 6 weeks. If you're willing, we'd like you to perform your original composition as part of the program. It would be your debut as an official Academy student. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Perform in front of a real audience? A very real audience, the bearded judge confirmed. Community leaders, music industry professionals, Academy donors, families of students. It's our biggest event of the year. Jake thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years of night shifts, listening to music through practice room doors, dreaming of being part of the musical world he cleaned up after. The scared little boy who had lost his piano lessons when Grandma Rose died. The young man who had convinced himself that music was a luxury he couldn't afford. What do you think, Mr. Thompson? Director Reynolds asked gently. Are you ready to take this step? Jake looked at the grand piano where he had just shared his heart with a room full of strangers. He thought about all the music still inside him, all the stories he wanted to tell through melodies and harmonies. He thought about Grandma Rose, who had always believed he had something special to offer the world. Yes, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I'm ready. The room erupted in applause again, but this time Jake didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready to begin the next chapter of his life, not as a janitor who happened to play piano, but as a musician who happened to have taken an unconventional path to his calling. As the audition officially concluded and people began to file out of the performance hall, Jake remained at the piano for a few extra moments. He played a soft, simple melody, a thank you to Grandma Rose, to the building that had been his classroom, and to the music that had never stopped calling to him. Director Reynolds paused in the doorway to listen to those final notes. In her decades of running the Academy, she had discovered many talented students, but she had never felt quite like this. Jake's story reminded her that music could come from anywhere, could touch anyone, and could transform lives in the most unexpected ways. 6 weeks later, Jake would perform his composition for an audience of 300 people, receiving a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But that triumph was still in the future. For now it was enough that he had found the courage to sit down at the piano and let his music speak for itself. The mockery had turned to respect. The skepticism had become admiration, and the janitor had become a musician. But perhaps most importantly, Jake had learned that his unconventional journey hadn't been a disadvantage after all. It had been exactly the path he needed to take to find his own unique voice in the world of music.